December 8, 1941. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in silence, his face betraying none of the turmoil churning within, as staff officers congratulated themselves on the morning's surprise attack. Through the window he could see officers celebrating what they believed was a decisive victory. Yet Yamamoto, one of the few Japanese leaders who truly understood American industrial capacity, felt only dread. He had lived in America. He had walked through Detroit's automobile factories. He had seen Texas oil fields stretching to the horizon. He knew what his nation had just awakened. 6 months earlier, I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months, but I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years, Yamamoto had warned Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye. Those words now echoed with prophetic weight. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been operationally brilliant, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and destroying nearly 200 aircraft. Yet the American aircraft carriers had escaped, and worse, Japan had unified a previously divided American public behind total war. The mathematics of defeat were already written. Yamamoto understood them even if his fellow commanders did not. What none of them knew was that this moment would trigger the most devastating industrial mobilization in human history, an awakening of productive capacity so overwhelming that Japan's military planners, despite their intelligence reports, despite their calculations, despite even their own fears, could not comprehend its true magnitude until far too late. The collapse of Japanese strategic assumptions had already begun. American industrial might would not just defeat Japan militarily. It would psychologically demolish every assumption the Japanese High Command held about warfare, national power, and their own chances of victory. The road to catastrophe had been paved with a fatal combination of ambition and miscalculation. Throughout the 1930s, Japan pursued territorial expansion to secure resources and living space. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the full-scale war with China beginning in 1937, and the occupation of French Indochina in 1940 all reflected Japan's determination to create a self-sufficient empire. Japanese planners understood the unfavorable discrepancy between the industrial potential of the Japanese Empire and that of the United States. This awareness shaped their entire war plan. The numbers told a sobering story. In 1937, Japan's industrial capacity represented approximately 5.2% of global manufacturing capability. This placed them roughly equal with France and about half the capacity of either Great Britain or the Soviet Union. The United States, by contrast, commanded nearly 42% of world industrial production. Even in the depths of the Great Depression, American war-making potential was approximately 7 to 10 times larger than Japan's. These statistics were available to Japanese planners. They knew them, they discussed them, yet they chose to gamble anyway. The gamble rested on a specific strategic assumption. Japanese success hinged on their ability to extend the strategic advantage gained at Pearl Harbor with additional rapid strategic victories. The plan was elegant in its desperation. Japan would strike the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, simultaneously seizing the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. These lightning victories would present America with a fait accompli, a defensive perimeter so vast and fortified that the cost of reconquering it would exceed American willingness to fight. Facing protracted war across the Pacific, America would negotiate a settlement recognizing Japan's conquests. Victory depended entirely on American unwillingness to pay the price of total war. This assumption would prove to be the greatest strategic miscalculation of the Pacific War. The Japanese High Command fundamentally misunderstood American character, industrial capacity, and national resolve. They projected their own resource limitations onto an enemy that operated under entirely different economic realities. Admiral Yamamoto understood this better than most. Before the war, he had spent time in the United States, first as a student at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, then as a naval attaché in Washington, from 1926 to 1928. He had travelled extensively across America. He had witnessed automobile production lines in Detroit churning out vehicles at rates that Japanese factories could barely comprehend. He had seen oil derricks dotting the Texas landscape, each one producing more petroleum than entire Japanese fields. He had observed the casual abundance of American civilian life, the vast agricultural production, the continental scope of American infrastructure. Before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had opposed going to war with America precisely because he understood these realities. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas, he wrote, knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. His opposition to war had made him politically vulnerable, forcing his transfer to command of the combined fleet partly to protect him from assassination by militarist factions within the army. Given the task of planning war against America, Yamamoto designed the Pearl Harbor attack with the hope of achieving the quick victory that represented Japan's only chance. But hope was not strategy, and Yamamoto's private doubts never translated into sufficient warning for his government. The first 6 months of the Pacific War seemed to validate Japanese strategy. The speed and scope of Japanese victories was breathtaking. Within days of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces struck American, British, and Dutch possessions throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Burma all fell to Japanese arms with shocking rapidity. By March 1942, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from the Chinese interior to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the approaches of Australia. The defensive perimeter was established. Raw materials, oil, rubber, tin, rice flowed to Japan. The war seemed to be proceeding according to plan. These victories created dangerous overconfidence among Japanese military leaders. The ease of conquest, the weakness of Allied resistance, and the apparent vindication of their strategy led many to believe that American industrial might had been overstated. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo began planning for even more ambitious operations, convinced that America lacked the will to fight back effectively. Yet even during this period of triumph, warning signs appeared for those willing to see them. The Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, though tactically insignificant, demonstrated American determination and capabilities that should have concerned Tokyo. 16 B-25 bombers, launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet 650 miles from Japan, struck Tokyo, Yokohama, and other cities. The damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was profound. Japanese territory had been violated. The sacred homeland had been bombed. The raid exposed Japan's vulnerability and prompted the decision to extend the defensive perimeter further eastward, ultimately leading to the Battle of Midway. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 provided another warning. Though tactically inconclusive, with both sides losing carriers, the strategic outcome favoured America. Japan's planned invasion of Port Moresby was abandoned. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese expansion had been checked. The battle demonstrated that American forces, even when outnumbered, could fight the Imperial Japanese Navy to a standstill. Then came Midway, June 4th through 7th, 1942. The battle that shattered Japanese naval supremacy and exposed the fatal flaws in their strategic calculations. Admiral Yamamoto had designed the Midway operation to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle. Japanese intelligence believed that the carrier Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, was out of action. They estimated American carrier strength in the Pacific at 2 vessels. In reality, American shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor had performed near miraculous repairs, returning Yorktown to service in just 72 hours of round-the-clock work. 3 American carriers would face 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. More critically, American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese naval communications. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken enough of the Japanese JN-25 code to determine that AF, the target of Japan's planned operation, was Midway Atoll. To confirm this, the Americans had Midway send a false message in plain text reporting fresh water shortages. Japanese radio traffic soon mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The trap was set. The battle itself unfolded with devastating speed. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu launched strikes against Midway Island itself. While their aircraft were away, American torpedo bombers from USS Enterprise, USS Hornet and USS Yorktown attacked the Japanese fleet. The torpedo attacks were slaughtered, with 41 of 41 Devastator torpedo bombers shot down. But they drew Japanese fighters to low altitude and scattered the combat air patrol. This left the sky clear for American dive bombers. At approximately 10:22 a.m., Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived simultaneously above the Japanese carriers. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga and Soryu, were mortally wounded, struck by bombs while their decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. The fires were catastrophic. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, survived temporarily and launched strikes that crippled Yorktown. But by evening, Hiryu too was fatally damaged by American dive bombers. By June 7th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had sunk, along with 1 cruiser. Japan lost 3,057 men, 248 aircraft, and critically, approximately 100 trained pilots and hundreds of irreplaceable aviation mechanics and technicians. American losses were lighter: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. The immediate tactical impact was clear. Japan lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific, but the deeper significance took longer to manifest. Midway exposed fundamental weaknesses in Japanese planning, training, and industrial capacity that would prove terminal. Japan entered the war with 6 large fleet carriers and 5 smaller ones. America had 3 large carriers in the Pacific at the war's start. The critical question was production capacity. How quickly could each nation replace losses? The answer would devastate Japanese strategic planning. American industrial mobilization in World War II represented the greatest sustained economic effort in human history. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, speaking to Congress less than a month after Pearl Harbor, laid out production goals that seemed fantastic even to his own advisers. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, increasing to 125,000 in 1943. 120,000 tanks in the same period. 55,000 anti-aircraft guns. These targets were met and exceeded. The statistics were staggering. In the 3 years following Midway, Japanese shipyards constructed 6 aircraft carriers. In the same period, American shipyards delivered 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and dozens of escort carriers. The Essex-class carriers themselves represented an industrial achievement that Japanese planners could barely comprehend. The United States Navy initially ordered 32 Essex-class carriers. Although not all were completed before war's end, 24 were built and 14 saw combat service in World War II. Each displaced 30,000 tons, measured 870 feet in length, and carried more than 90 aircraft. At peak production, American shipyards were launching 1 Essex-class carrier approximately every 6 weeks. In 1944 alone, American factories produced more aircraft than Japan built during the entire war period from 1939 to 1945. America produced approximately 297,000 aircraft during the war. Japan produced approximately 76,000. American shipyards delivered more tonnage in the first 4.5 months of 1943 than Japan launched in 7 years. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant outside Detroit produced 1 B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. The numbers extended across every category of military production. American factories built 86,000 tanks compared to Japan's approximately 2,000 medium and heavy tanks. America produced 2 million trucks. Japan managed approximately 165,000. In artillery pieces, small arms, ammunition, and every other category of war materiel, American production exceeded Japanese output by factors of 5 to 20. Japanese military planners had access to much of this information through intelligence reports, neutral country sources, and simple observation of equipment appearing in combat. Yet the numbers created cognitive dissonance that prevented proper strategic adjustment. The figures were so overwhelming that accepting them meant accepting inevitable defeat. Japanese commanders chose instead to hope that the numbers were exaggerated, that American quality would prove inferior to Japanese fighting spirit, that somehow the tide could be turned through tactical brilliance and self-sacrifice. Admiral Yamamoto never suffered these delusions. His understanding of American power only deepened as the war progressed. Historians debate whether Yamamoto actually spoke the famous words attributed to him after Pearl Harbor. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." No written record of this exact quotation exists. The line appeared first in the 1970 film Tora, Tora, Tora. But whether Yamamoto spoke those precise words or not, the sentiment accurately reflected his documented views. What Yamamoto definitely did write in a letter on January 9, 1942, was this: "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one smitten." He understood that defeating an unprepared enemy proved nothing about relative strength. The true test would come when America fully mobilized its industrial might. That mobilization gathered momentum throughout 1942 and reached full force by 1943. The industrial statistics translated into operational reality across every Pacific battlefield. At Guadalcanal, from August 1942 through February 1943, American forces demonstrated their ability to sustain combat operations across vast oceanic distances. The campaign became a grinding attritional struggle that exposed another Japanese vulnerability: logistics, supply, replacement, industrial capacity. Japan had planned for quick, decisive battles, not sustained operations draining resources. The Japanese merchant fleet, essential for supplying far-flung garrisons, steadily eroded under American submarine attack. Japanese merchant ship production never matched losses. In 1943, American submarines sank more Japanese tonnage than Japanese shipyards launched. By 1944, Japan's merchant marine was in terminal decline, unable to supply captured territories or transport resources back to the home islands. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, the resource Japan had gone to war to secure, increasingly remained undelivered as tankers fell victim to American torpedoes. Japanese aircraft production illustrated similar patterns. While American factories churned out newer, better designs in massive quantities, Japanese production stagnated both in numbers and technology. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, brilliant when introduced in 1940, remained in frontline service throughout the war with only minor modifications. American fighters progressed from the adequate F-4F Wildcat to the superior F-6F, Hellcat to the exceptional F-4U Corsair, each iteration outperforming its predecessor. By 1943, American fighters were demonstrably better than Japanese designs, and they appeared in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese air units. The pilot training differential compounded these advantages. America's vast educational infrastructure supported massive pilot training programs. Aviation cadets received thorough instruction in multi-engine aircraft, navigation, tactics, and gunnery. Completion rates remained high, and the pipeline of new pilots grew throughout the war. Japan's training programs, resource-constrained and casualties depleted, shortened training periods, and reduced standards. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with a fraction of the flight hours their American counterparts received. Superior American aircraft flown by better-trained pilots produced predictable results. Japanese aircrew losses became unsustainable. Yet even as evidence of American industrial supremacy mounted, many Japanese commanders clung to hope grounded in Japan's warrior ethos. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan, suggested that superior morale and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Bushido traditions emphasized honor, sacrifice, and death before surrender. These cultural factors, while producing individual acts of remarkable courage, prevented realistic strategic reassessment. The fall of the Mariana Islands in summer 1944 marked the moment when the Japanese High Command could no longer maintain illusions about the war's trajectory. The invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944. American forces, supported by massive naval gunfire and abundant supplies, steadily overwhelmed Japanese defenders. The fighting was savage, with Japanese soldiers and civilians choosing death over capture, but the outcome was never in doubt. Saipan fell on July 9, 1944. Tinian followed on August 1st. Guam was secured by August 10th. The strategic implications were severe. The Marianas placed American B-29 superfortress bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The carefully constructed defensive perimeter had been penetrated. Japan itself now faced direct strategic bombing. The loss signaled that Japan could no longer prevent American advances. The overwhelming superiority in ships, aircraft, supplies, and trained personnel meant that American forces could strike anywhere and prevail through sheer material advantage. Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo, who had pushed Japan into war, received blame for the Marianas disaster. He was forced to resign on July 18, 1944, having lost political support. His successor, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited an impossible situation. The war was effectively lost, but surrender remained politically and militarily unthinkable. Japan would fight on, hoping for a miracle that would never come. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19 to 20, 1944, concurrent with the Marianas invasion, provided another demonstration of American material supremacy. Japanese naval aviation, attempting to attack American carriers, was slaughtered in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days of air combat, Japan lost approximately 480 aircraft and 3 carriers, including the newest carrier Taiho. American losses were comparatively light. Japanese naval aviation, already weakened by years of attrition, never recovered. American commanders now understood that they held overwhelming advantages. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, and General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Southwest Pacific Forces, conducted operations with confidence born of material abundance. When planning invasions, American forces assumed generous supply ratios, abundant ammunition, and continuous reinforcement. Japanese defenders, by contrast, fought with dwindling supplies, scarce ammunition, and no prospect of relief. The Philippines campaign, October 1944 through July 1945, exemplified this disparity. American forces landed on Leyte on October 20, 1944, supported by the largest naval armada assembled in the Pacific War to that date. Japanese naval forces, in a desperate gambit, committed virtually their entire remaining fleet to the defense of the Philippines in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 23 to 26, 1944. The result was the largest naval battle in history and a complete Japanese defeat. 4 separate engagements made up the battle. In the Philippine Sea, American carrier aircraft sank the massive battleship Musashi. In Surigao Strait, American battleships and destroyers destroyed a Japanese southern force. Off Samar, a Japanese center force encountered American escort carriers in a confused action where Japanese command failures prevented complete American disaster. Finally, off Cape Engano, American carriers destroyed the remnants of Japanese carrier aviation. By October 26th, Japanese naval power had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and thousands of trained seamen. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again sortie in fleet strength. The strategic bombing of Japan, which intensified throughout 1944 and 1945, brought the war's industrial implications home to Japanese civilians and leaders alike. B-29 superfortresses, flying from the Marianas, struck Japanese cities with increasing frequency and severity. The bombing campaign evolved from precision strikes against specific industrial targets to area bombing designed to destroy Japan's urban manufacturing centers. Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, represented the destructive peak of the campaign. 334 B-29 bombers dropped approximately 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo's densely packed residential and industrial districts. The resulting firestorm killed approximately 100,000 people, destroyed 16 square miles of the city, and left more than 1 million people homeless. It was the single most destructive air raid in human history, more deadly than either atomic bombing that would follow. The toll on Japanese cities was staggering. 66 other cities suffered similar incendiary attacks. By war's end, approximately 350,000 to 500,000 Japanese civilians had died in the strategic bombing campaign. Major industrial cities were reduced to ash. Yet even this destruction did not break Japanese will to resist. The military government, dominated by army officers committed to fighting to national extinction, refused to consider surrender. Emperor Hirohito, traditionally remaining above political and military decisions, became increasingly concerned as the true situation became clear. The emperor was regularly briefed on the war's progress. By early 1945, he understood that Japan faced defeat. Yet the emperor's constitutional position and the political strength of the army prevented him from directly ordering surrender. Japan's government was paralyzed between the reality of certain defeat and the cultural impossibility of accepting it. The Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan on August 8, 1945, shattered Japan's last diplomatic hope. Japanese leaders had attempted to use Soviet neutrality to negotiate a settlement. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941 had allowed both nations to focus elsewhere. Japanese diplomats hoped Stalin might mediate between Japan and the Western Allies, perhaps securing terms short of unconditional surrender. This hope was delusional. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had promised to enter the war against Japan within 90 days of Germany's defeat. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. On August 8, exactly 90 days later, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria with overwhelming strength, crushing Japanese armies that had been stripped of resources to defend the home islands. In 1 week, Soviet forces overran Japanese positions that had taken years to construct. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's most formidable formation, disintegrated under Soviet assault. The Soviet invasion meant Japan now faced enemies on all fronts with no prospect of diplomatic escape. Yet even this catastrophe did not immediately produce surrender. The Japanese government, particularly the army leadership, proposed continuing the war through national suicide, inflicting such casualties on American invasion forces that favourable peace terms might still be secured. This fantasy persisted even after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. The bombs killed approximately 130,000 people initially, with tens of thousands dying later from radiation effects. Yet within Japan's military government, army hardliners argued that surrender remained dishonourable. Only Emperor Hirohito's personal intervention, breaking with constitutional precedent, forced Japan's capitulation. On August 15, 1945, The emperor's recorded voice broadcast surrender to the Japanese people. It was the first time most Japanese had heard their emperor speak. His words carefully avoided the term surrender, instead announcing that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The announcement stunned a population that had been told Japan was winning. The reality of defeat, suddenly acknowledged, shattered the propaganda that had sustained Japanese morale. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, oversaw Japan's occupation and reconstruction. The occupation exposed Japanese people directly to American material abundance and organizational efficiency. American soldiers arrived with equipment, supplies, and resources that Japanese civilians had never imagined existed. For Japanese military leaders, post-war interrogation and war crimes trials forced painful acknowledgement of their failures. Former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, on trial for war crimes, was forced to admit that Japan had underestimated American industrial capacity. "We did not adequately understand the American potential," he testified. This represented extraordinary admission from a man who had led Japan into war. Post-war interrogations of Japanese military personnel revealed systematic failures in understanding American military capabilities beyond simple production statistics. Japanese planners had failed to grasp American logistics capabilities, the ability to project power across vast oceanic distances while maintaining adequate supply. They had underestimated American technological innovation. Most critically, they had failed to understand that American military doctrine emphasized material advantage rather than warrior spirit. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier striking force at Pearl Harbor and Midway, died by suicide during the Battle of Saipan in July 1944. But his staff officers survived to testify about Japanese planning assumptions. They acknowledged that Japanese intelligence had provided accurate information about American industrial production. The failure was not intelligence gathering but strategic assessment. Japanese commanders had known the numbers but refused to accept their implications. Post-war analysis by both Japanese and American historians identified the core of Japan's strategic failure. Japan had gambled on a short war because Japanese leaders understood they could not win a long one. But the gamble rested on assumptions about American psychology that proved completely wrong. Japanese planners believed Americans were soft, decadent, divided, and unwilling to endure hardship. Pearl Harbor would shock them into accepting Japanese hegemony in Asia. Instead, Pearl Harbor unified American society behind total war. The attack transformed American industrial might from potential to kinetic. Roosevelt's production goals, which had seemed fantastic in December 1941, were met and exceeded because American industry, labor, and agriculture fully mobilized. Women entered factories in massive numbers. Agricultural productivity increased through mechanization. Raw material extraction expanded dramatically. The American economy grew at 15% annually throughout the war years, while simultaneously supporting military production, civilian consumption, and massive aid to allied nations. The contrast with Japan was stark. Japan's economy, far smaller to begin with, faced crippling constraints. American submarine warfare devastated Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off resources from conquered territories. Strategic bombing destroyed urban manufacturing. The blockade reduced Japanese industrial output through raw material shortages. By 1945, Japanese aircraft production had declined to approximately 150 aircraft per month. American production exceeded 8,000 monthly. Japanese soldiers faced ammunition shortages, while American forces had ammunition to waste. Japanese civilians starved while American servicemen ate abundantly. Several former Japanese officers, in memoirs and interviews decades after the war, offered frank assessments of their strategic failures. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, last commander of the combined fleet, wrote in his 1950 memoirs that Japan had fought a war it could not win from the beginning. "We understood American material superiority intellectually, but we did not grasp its implications emotionally. We believed spirit could overcome matter. This was our fundamental error. Mitsumasa Yonai, who served as Prime Minister and Navy Minister at various times during the war, told interrogators in 1945 that Japanese naval officers had warned civilian leaders that war with America was unwinnable. These warnings were ignored by army leaders who controlled government policy. Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving fighter ace with 64 confirmed victories, wrote extensively after the war about the declining quality of Japanese pilots and aircraft as the conflict progressed. In his autobiography Samurai, published in 1957, Sakai described watching newly trained pilots deployed to combat with minimal flight hours. They were slaughtered. They never had a chance. By 1944, we veteran pilots knew we were losing. We could see the quality of American aircraft improving while ours stagnated. We could see the numbers of American planes increasing while ours declined. But we kept fighting because we had no choice. The industrial statistics that documented Japan's defeat were compiled after the war by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. The final accounting was stark. America produced approximately 2/3 of all Allied military equipment during the war. American factories had built more than 5,000 ships. American shipyards replaced all Allied shipping sunk by Axis forces and then built additional capacity beyond pre-war tonnage. Japanese production, by comparison, had proven utterly inadequate. Japan built 6 carriers after Midway. America built 122 carriers of all types. Japan produced 76,000 aircraft total. America produced nearly 300,000. Japan built approximately 165,000 trucks. America built 2 million. In steel production, oil refining, aluminum fabrication, electronics, and every other category of industrial output, American production exceeded Japanese capacity by factors of 10 to 20. The human cost of Japan's miscalculation was staggering. Approximately 2,800,000 Japanese military personnel died in the war. Between 500,000 and 1 million Japanese civilians died from bombing, starvation, and war-related causes. These casualties occurred in a war that Japanese leaders had initiated while understanding it was unwinnable. For the Japanese High Command, the moment of true realization came at different times for different individuals. Some, like Yamamoto, understood from the beginning. Others maintained delusions until Saipan fell, or Leyte Gulf, or the atomic bombings. But eventually, all confronted the same inescapable truth. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually became the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s, the lessons of 1941 to 1945 shaped Japanese thinking about power, prosperity, and international relations. Modern Japan achieved far greater success through trade and industry than it ever gained through military conquest. The industrial capacity that Japanese leaders in the 1930s sought to seize through force was ultimately developed through peaceful enterprise. The story of Japan's High Command finally realizing America's true power is ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangers of strategic self-deception. Information was available, warnings were given, evidence accumulated. Yet institutional momentum, cultural biases, and political constraints prevented rational strategic reassessment until defeat became undeniable. For individual Japanese officers, the realization came through different experiences at different times. Some witnessed it in the avalanche of American aircraft. Others saw it in the endless supplies supporting American advances. Some understood when their own forces went hungry while American prisoners ate abundantly. Others comprehended only when B-29s turned their cities to ash. America's industrial capacity was not propaganda. It was not exaggeration. It was a material reality that determined the war's outcome as surely as if the final battles had already been fought in December 1941. The Japanese High Command had awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant possessed productive power beyond Japanese capacity to resist. The mathematical certainty of defeat had been written in production statistics before Pearl Harbor. Japanese planners had access to those numbers. They simply chose not to believe them until the evidence became undeniable. In that choice lay the destruction of Imperial Japan and the deaths of millions. The price of strategic delusion, paid in full by August 1945, served as history's most expensive lesson in the relationship between industrial power and military outcome.